Hello, everybody. Welcome to class. Today, we are going to be talking about secondary data analysis and also some mixed methods. These are distinct. I guess Engel and Shute decided to put them and merge them into the same chapter, give them slightly shorter treatment of each one. But I think it also makes sense because in some ways, it will review concepts that pertain to other aspects of data analysis, and it's simply then a new version or a new rejiggering, new reconfiguration of how it is that we do it. So, that's kind of how we'll be exploring this. When we talk about secondary data analysis, we'll be exploring some of the different analysis sources and understanding simply what it is, advantages, challenges. We'll also look at big data because often, but not always, often, our secondary data sources that we use come from big data sets. Now we'll explore some of the uh, ethics of it. And then we'll talk then briefly about mixed methods, which is basically bringing quantitative methods and qualitative methods. And rather than hemming and hawing over which one is better, we can then just say, well, we'll do both. And we'll create our research project that way. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Alrighty, let's dive in. So when we talk about secondary data analysis, the term itself really means that we're not doing primary data analysis. Primary data would be data that I myself have gathered. So that would be, kind of I had a hand in designing the study. Maybe I used some surveys, maybe I did some observations, but I was the one who gathered the data. In this regard, secondary data analysis means I did not gather each of the data points, somebody else did, and then I was then granted access or gained access somehow to a data set. So, and it was all packaged up. And if I'm lucky, then I'll have, a code book and various other documents that will support that data set. So that way I can understand how the data was gathered and the types of questions that were asked and what the responses mean, because it could be in very cryptic codes or just be random numbers. And I need to know, well, what does a number stand for? What is the significance of that number? So, so really, it's this method of doing data analysis, doing research where you're using a pre-existing data set to answer that question. There are lots of different data sources. Oftentimes, though, many of these data sources will require large amounts of money uh, in order to be able to gather these data sets. So these are bigger funders that will have that data available for us. Maybe it could be the US federal government, or there's the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research. There can also be qualitative data sources such as Twitter or X. I know people have used that, and there's huge amounts of data that can be available there or on Facebook, where you're simply looking at what people have publicly posted. Or other social media sites. That can be a source of data. There's also international data sources as well. And a lot of times, because these data sources are so massive and the data sets are so massive, that the people who host it or the institutions that host it will actually have a lot of protocol and who gets access to it. Maybe they'll have trainings to get you oriented to the whole database because it could be really overwhelming, especially if these are longitudinal data. It's not just one file that you would download that has everything, but you would even need to pick and choose which components of the data you actually want. Now, when I did my dissertation, I used the 2018 WAVE of the National Financial Capability Study, which was put on, hosted by FINRA, which is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. And so, this was a data set that I accessed, and I used the most recent one. There were ones that were older than that. I've also used the SHED survey. This is the Survey of Household Economics and Decision Making that's hosted by the Federal Reserve Board. The University of Michigan has the Health and Retirement Study, which is a longitudinal panel, which means that they are working with and they've got participants who are in it for the long haul over many, many years. And so it surveys this representative sample of approximately 20,000 people in America. So if you have 20,000 people, all contributing data over multiple years, that's a ton of data, but it's incredibly rich data. Figuring out what to do with it, that's your question. And so when we have secondary data analysis, it allows us to understand, processes that might otherwise be inaccessible. So, me sitting here at, up in North Dakota, I can't necessarily just pick up and go find, somebody who lives in California, and to see what their experience is like. But I may be able to do that with some of these national large data sets. So it can save huge amounts of time and money. Now, it saved me time because I didn't, on my dissertation, because I didn't have to gather the information. But having our lawyers go back and forth to determine, what I was going to be doing with the data set, and that I was going to be handling it properly. Basically, it took them 3 months to come to a determination that I was going to sign a document and our lawyer was going to sign the same document. So sometimes it saves you time, sometimes it doesn't, and it's just simply different time spent differently. But it did save me money because it was free. Now, at the same time, you can avoid, many data collection problems, such as having to chase down people if they're not responding. Um, yeah. And, it helps you to be able to compare other, samples and different sample groups. So maybe I've got access to one group, but there's a population that I don't have access to, but they were included in this data set. Then I can begin, looking at some of those comparisons. Um, and so you can get a wide range of different types of variables, and you can mix them and match them in different ways. And in doing so, then you can begin to explore some of these new intersections of how life is in ways that you may not have actually thought about before accessing this wide range of different types of questions. And so you can also then take a look and perhaps see, over time across, multiple studies, seeing how people are developing, and so you can have some comparison there as well. On the other hand, there can be limitations. If the person who is collecting the data, you really have no control over how that went, and if they misunderstood something, or if a question was misunderstood or interpreted differently. Uh, and at the same time, because somebody else picked the questions, you don't get to. You're limited to only just this one menu of questions, and if you don't like them, tough noogies. So, that is a challenge, and especially for me, where I'm looking at in areas that most scholars are not, and thereby most researchers are not, trying to find sufficiently large data sets that ask the types of financial questions and behavioral health questions that I want. That actually becomes really tough because sometimes there only may be one question on financial anxiety, and they're not thinking then in terms of physical health or other forms of gambling addiction, or uh, just stress levels and financial trauma. So they may be missing a lot of that other aspect that I want to include or look at, uh, and because they simply weren't thinking about that. So so that is a challenge. And so you really can't then test and refine the methods used on, based on preliminary feedback. So if I did like a pilot study and then I wanted to refine the questions or ask different questions, I can't do that. I'm stuck with the data set that I'm given. So we'll explore a little bit of how to handle that with the mixed methods that you can. But for our purposes, secondary data analysis, you get what you get, and you're going to be stuck with that. So that is the challenge there. Now, I've been talking about large data sets, and so part of what this is all called are big data. And so these are like humongous data sets that are accessible for computer readable formats. It's produced by people, and it requires the use of a computer. It's not something you can just tally by hand. Maybe if you did a survey, on Facebook, all right, you got 50 responses. You might need to, you might be able to kind of tally up, okay, well, what did everybody do? And, maybe you might use Excel for that, or you could even do it by hand. When we're talking about big data, there is no way you can do that by hand. And just to kind of give you a sense of the scope when we're talking about big data, the National Institute of Health, or NIH, has a data set, or really a data program called All of Us. And All of Us is really designed to gather data statistics around the health of people all across the United States, with a particular emphasis that when you have such a large data set, that you're able to then gain a statistically significant sample size of marginalized communities. Because a lot of these communities or individuals, they may be one person among 100. And so to get a large enough, sample size to understand what that person and their unique perspectives are, especially if they're a marginalized person, then you need, say, 100,000 just to get, 1,000 people from that group in order to be able to do a decent sized data, and a decently powered data analysis. So with this data set, you've got, encroaching, well over 750,000 and almost 1 million participants. You've got almost 500,000 of electronic health records, and over 500,000 of biosamples that have been received. And so, these are people who, wide range, all kinds of diversity, everybody is represented, hence, the term all of us. So that kind of gives you the size of the scope. I mean, there's no way one person could gather, 848,000, participant samples. I mean, that's not realistic, but so it's a massive coordinated effort. But the insights then that are possible are really, really important, and very, very helpful for advancing our understanding of human well-being and health, and so forth. Now, some of the ethical issues here is confidentiality, and that's, goes across the board, and it's no different here. And so, this is something that you always want to make sure that identifying information is removed, and sometimes that will require getting access to a more specialized data set. And so, for instance, this was something where and part of the reason why I needed to sign some legal paperwork to get access to my data set was because some of this confidential information was included in the data set. It wasn't part of what was publicly available. So I needed to promise and make sure, tell them, hey, I'm not going to be using this for any nefarious or untoward reasons. And so one of the things that they will often do as a part of making these data sets available is that they will make sure that there's a minimum of 10 individuals, 10 samples for any given zip code. So if there's only one or two people in a given zip code, sometimes it can, you can kind of take a look at how this person responded and their different demographics, and you might even be able to identify who that person is. If you've got at least 10 people there within that demographic, then it becomes harder to distinguish who it actually is is referring to. But this actually goes back to that issue of why having a big data set is important, because if we were talking about marginalized communities, um, it allows for us to be able to then have that sample size. At the same time, the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board, regardless of what type of research that you're doing, they have the responsibility to decide, when a review is needed and to approve then the proposals for the secondary data analysis. Now, one of the helpful things oftentimes is that because the data has already been gathered, you're not actually interacting with the participant, and it's a non-issue in terms of what types of protections are needed, especially if the data has already been made anonymous. So there's no interaction with you. And so a review by the IRB, you would be determined as being exempt or not needing a review. And so, whereas for very in-depth dissertations for some students, it can take months of going back and forth with the IRB to finally get approval because you're working with a particularly vulnerable population. But with a big data set like this, where the get data has already been gathered, there's no issue. And so for my IRB, for my dissertation, it took me 17 minutes to get my response that I was cleared and good to go and was exempt. So that's actually, a helpful thing, but simply something you need to be aware of. And then, there's always, data quality is the concern. And so you also want to know, well, all right, well, who is included and how are they categorized? And you need to understand what are the limitations here. So for instance, one of the limitations that I had was I could only categorize people as being Black, in comparison to being white. But I understood that there is an incredible amount of diversity within the white community and within the Black community. And so I had to make certain decisions of, am I including folks who identified as Black and as Hispanic as an ethnicity? Am I including, and to think about some of the cultural context and the differences between people who identify as African American versus are immigrants from any number of countries in Africa. Are they biracial? In which case, are they Black? Are they white? Are they both? Are they Caribbean? So there's a wide range of diversity here within the Black community, that, has impacts on their ethnicity, the ways that they engage with family, their understanding of racism and structural racism and poverty, worldviews and mindsets, likelihood of having educated parents. All of these types of things will add an infinite amount of variability. And yet, all I could see was, all right, are they Black or not? So, you need to understand that, especially when it's government agency and they are creating the categories, the demographic categories, you're kind of limited there. And so you need to understand and appreciate that there is going to be some limitations in the quality, because I was not able to get at that type of nuance there. So big social justice implications. Okay, let's transition now. Ooh, almost dropped my water. Let's put the lid on that one. Okay. Um, so we're transitioning now to mixed methods. And so rather than, kind of going back and forth, hemming and hawing, fretting about the trade-offs between the approaches, do I do a qualitative? Do I do a quantitative? I'm only a qualitative person, or I'm only a quantitative person. If you appreciate both of them, sometimes you just want to do both. And that's what a mixed methods approach can be. So this would be really, where you've got no single data set or analytic methodology, can really kind of give us the full perspective. And so this can be a really helpful approach. Now, part of the way in which they do mixed methods is that rather than just simply developing a theory and then Okay, well, that's that out of a qualitative approach. Or we might only, just take a look at the numbers. And so that's kind of got its own philosophical approaches. Here is one around pragmatism. So basically, you engage and you learn through the reflection, and it leads to the generation of knowledge. So you're learning as you go, you're having a back and forth conversation between the quantitative and the qualitative findings. It becomes then a very iterative process where you learn through doing. Uh, and perhaps one basic way in which you can do a mixed methods would be through the survey. And so if you have both quantitative questions, and people are responding to items or statements on a scale, and space for qualitative responses, then you're doing a mixed methods. And especially if you're then bringing some qualitative technique to understanding and coding the different types of qualitative responses. Boom, you're doing it there. So that would be an example of mixed methods in its most basic. Now you can have, to get it more formal here, you can have integrated designs where you've got the qualitative and the quantitative are happening at the same time. They're both being given equal importance. And so that's denoted by uppercase qual plus quan, or quantitative. Or you can have embedded designs. And this is where it's given differing priority. And so perhaps the quantitative is the main piece. And so you've got your big survey, say, with many, many questions that are quantitative. And then you've got one text box that's got then a little bit of the qualitative. So that one would be, yes, they're being used concurrently, but really the quantitative is the predominant, and the qualitative is just being used to add a little bit of more in-depth understanding of your quantitative. Or it could be the other way around. When I was in Bolivia, I was having interviews with folks, and was really generating a lot of rich understanding. And then I also then included a little bit of quantitative numbers just to kind of add uh, some understanding of, well, just how many people are experiencing this, and the issue. So there can be different or simultaneous in sequence, so happening at the same time or happening at different times. They can have different or equal priority. So that's how we would understand these different approaches of mixed methods. Uh, Strengths, it enhances some of the measurement validity, the generalizability. We understand a bit more about it. It becomes much more of an authentic research. At the same time, you may not have the strengths in one method or the other that is needed. And so you need to have either to gain that expertise, which, it can take a long time to gain true expertise and mastery, or you would need to then partner with somebody else. And it can take a lot more time to analyze all of that data. So to get around that, folks will oftentimes work in a team, or each team member has these different strengths that they are able to then contribute to the whole. Perhaps you're in a class in which you're working with a team member and you're finding that team member has different strengths than you. This is actually intentional and by design, and hopefully you're able to collaborate, and each is able to contribute what they do best, which then can make for having more eyes, and ultimately better understanding and better learning around the concept as a whole, because you're bringing different strengths to bear on it. So that is some of the challenges, but it may not actually be a challenge. It may turn into actually being a strength. And so ultimately, again, we still have ethical concerns, that we want to make sure that nobody is being harmed. But at the same time, especially if you're changing from, say, being just having a survey to actually having in-depth observations, uh, the research participant may need to have a new understanding of what is your role as the researcher, especially if it keeps changing based on the different types of research that you're doing. And so you should always, then renegotiate their consent for you to be involved in understanding and gathering the data, especially as you change to then be part of these different stages and different approaches of gathering the data. All righty. So hope that has been helpful, and I will see you later in the next video. Thanks so much.